All right, so this is similar to the segment that we were looking at in the video, so probably somewhere in like the upper thoracic region of the spinal cord. Part of why I can tell that is because if I look at this spinal cord, I see that in the gray matter, there is a distinct lateral horn. And the reason for that is that the lateral horn is where we find the cell bodies for visceral or autonomic motor neurons. So this is where like your sympathetic neurons show up, at least the motor neurons and the first one in the chain. So if I were to start a like sympathetic command, so like, hey, I don't know, blood vessel to the intestines. I'm freaking out and I want that blood vessel wall to constrict. Then I would start that signal out this way, and that motor neuron of the autonomic system found here would have an axon that goes out, goes through the ventral horn, and then exits that, and then goes out these little rootlets that are down here. Goes out through the ventral or anterior root, and then goes out to the target organ. If I were thinking about a skeletal or like somatic motor neuron, consciously controlled one, we find those in the ventral horn or the anterior horn. So if I think to myself, oh, I want to take a deep breath in, so I'm going to activate an intercostal nerve in the thoracic region. What I'm going to see then is that that nerve cell body is right here. It receives a signal on a dendrite from the brain, and that turns it on. And then that motor neuron multipolar cell body has an axon that exits and then goes out the ventral horn, out the ventral rootlets to the ventral root, and then goes out to whatever nerve that it's going to. If I then like were to tickle someone, say in the same region, like tickle like someone like right above their ribs, that sensory information would come in through a sensory fiber. If it was on the anterior surface of their body, it would come in through this big anterior ramus or branch of the spinal nerve. If it was on their back, like close to the spinal column or the vertebral column, it would come in through this smaller posterior ramus. It's smaller because you think about like there's a lot less tissue behind your vertebral column than there is in front of it. So a lot less wires needed. So posterior ramus, anterior ramus. It would come in then through the spinal nerve, which is just this segment right here, and then it splits. Since it's a sensory input signal in, it's going to go through the posterior root, past this swelling, the posterior root ganglion, and then from there it goes into the posterior horn, the pointy one that gets almost out to the edge of the white matter right there. And then that axon will end on usually an interneuron in this space. There are some reflexes, like the one for the virtual lab this week, that have a part of the axon that jumps all the way over and goes to a motor neuron. And that would be a single synapse reflex, so monosynaptic reflex. If you looked at something more complicated like the crossed extensor, you'd have a synapse here with an interneuron, and that interneuron would go and tell one muscle to get excited and one muscle group to get inhibited. So allowing you to flex on one side and extend on the other. It's like if I want to flex my arm, I have to inhibit the triceps and stimulate the biceps. And so you've got to tell both muscles what to do. In order for like a stimulus, like someone grabbing on my right side, so the right side, to cause an effect on the opposite contralateral side, you have to have that interneuron send one axon collateral across the gray commissure, which is this middle portion, so that it can get to the other side. So it's part of why we see gray matter linking them, is that you have some of these interneurons that span that gap in there. And it's kind of hard to see on this model, but there is a little divot in here that's a central canal in that space. And then if I were to ask about the columns, I just basically divide it out by the horns. So the ventral or the dorsal or posterior horn, it divides the posterior column from the lateral column. And then kind of like right about here is lateral column to anterior column. So just basic body direction on those ones. And then these models, I have them mostly taped up. You can remove the tape, just stick it on the wood, because I won't have this visible during the quiz. But that also reminds you where we find the cell bodies for these different ones in here too.